Well, lovely to see you all this evening, albeit virtually. And it's a great pleasure to be introduced. We've got three this evening. Professor Jonathan Bloom, who needs absolutely no introduction, and has probably written more books than we've got more. I can't think how many books he's written, but you'll recall that on the 1st of July, he started off this series. So it's great to have him back to chair. And then Professor Andrew Petersen of the University of Wales, Trinity St David, where he's Director of Research in Islamic Archaeology, will act as the discussant. And he's very well qualified to do this, in as much as he's had considerable work working on Hajj routes in Palestine and Ottoman buildings. And he was also with the British Museum's on the British Museum's Hajj Exhibition Advisory Committee. So I'm sure he knows quite a lot about the Kaaba as well. And Simon O'Meara, who needs absolutely no introduction, certainly to Islamic Art Circle members, is lecturer in Islamic art history at SOAS. And he's has his regional specialism is Morocco, but he also is very interested in research into the Islamic visuality and the materiality of Islam. And his latest book, The Kaaba in Orientations, is what we're here and gathered together to discuss this evening. So I'll hand you over to Simon and Andrew. I think Simon will give a presentation with PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, Jonathan will speak. Will obviously speak first as chair. And then one thing that I forgot to mention at the last meeting was, please, if you have any questions, the chat room's there in the bottom of the sort of center bottom of the screen, and post your questions through that, and then eventually those will be answered as well, hopefully. But anyway, welcome to everybody, and let's continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. And Allison for also organizing this. And greetings from Richmond, New Hampshire, across the Atlantic. We're gathered, as Rosalind said, to celebrate the publication of Simon O'Meara's new book, The Kaaba Orientations, Reading in Islam's Ancient House. And it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce my old friend Simon in this wonderful book, which I have to say is perhaps the most original one to be published in the field this year. And I say that, as Rosalind mentioned, because I published my own book in June, and it doesn't compare in originality. Simon's book, which he'll tell us much more about in a bit, goes where no scholar in the field has dared to go before, which is to explore the Kaaba in Mecca, the central focus of Islamic worship and belief. That he has taken this extraordinary challenge is no surprise to me, because Simon is perhaps the most original thinker in the field that I know. And this reflects, of course, his unusually broad training in the UK and the USA, in the history of art, and in Arabic and Middle Eastern studies. He's taught in the Middle East, in Europe, and in the USA, and for several years has been teaching at SOAS in London. He's been awarded prestigious research fellowships in Europe and the USA, not only in the history of art, but also in religious studies. You will soon see, if you don't know already, why he's also won awards for his engaging teaching. Simon has apparently read everything, and what is even more impressive is that he has absorbed it all. In his writing, he effortlessly glides his readers not only through the forests of the history of art, both Islamic and Western, but also through such related thickets of religion, philosophy, and anthropology, often exploring the theoretical aspects of the subject. Simon's first book, Space in Muslim Urban Life, was published in 2007, and it focused on walls and the idea of walling in the historic city of Fez, Morocco. And he continues to have an abiding interest in the Maghrib and in Islamic urbanism. But in his more recent work, he's gone in an entirely new direction, looking at what I might call the Islamic in Islamic art, with studies of such topics as the Prophet's Night Journey, Islamic conceptions of heaven and hell, the pilgrimage, Sufism, and the Quran as they relate to the visual arts. These studies have culminated in this study of the Kaaba, the central focus of Islamic ritual, space, and thought. Although all devout Muslims turn towards the Kaaba 5 times a day as the focus of worship, and all Muslims are expected, if they're able, to personally visit the Kaaba on the pilgrimage once in their lifetimes, it is absolutely extraordinary to me that previous scholars have simply avoided the subject. Most have dismissed the Kaaba as of little or no architectural interest or of interest of the art historian, and they've never dared to confront what the Kaaba is, what it was, and how Muslims approach and think about it. As you'll soon see, Simon has just shown how wrong they have been because they all asked all the wrong questions. In this book, this wonderful book, he works from the outside in, starting with how the Kaaba orients cities throughout the Muslim world and working his way closer and closer until we finally enter the Kaaba to discover what is or isn't inside. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to the author himself. And as Rosalind said, his talk will be followed by a discussion with Andrew Petersen, and then use the chat feature if you have any questions. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much. You've completely left me without the words now that I had written. They aren't sufficient to thank you for such a beautiful encomium and introduction for me. I'm so touched immensely. As you all have seen in the acknowledgements, because you've read the book, but perhaps those who haven't read the book yet will see in the acknowledgements, I make it very clear there that Professor Bloom input, Professor Bloom's advice and support were absolutely key to this book and to this book actually coming to light. And whatever the merits that this book might have, they are tied to Professor Bloom. But beyond that, your introduction just now really touches me immensely, and I just wish to say personally, directly to you, thank you, Jonathan. How kind you've been to me, how good you've been to me, and I would not be at SOAS, I would not be sitting before anyone on virtually tonight had it not been for your support, and I am immensely grateful. Thank you. Talking specifically about tonight's book launch, I would like to make a very big thanks to the Royal Asiatic Society and the Islamic Arts Circle at SOAS for organising and hosting this event, specifically Dr. Alison Ota, Director of the Royal Asiatic Society, and Dr. Rosalind Wade-Haddon, Honorary Secretary of the Islamic Arts Circle at SOAS. Many, many thanks to Professor Andrew Petersen for agreeing to act as discussant, and Professor Bloom, Jonathan, for agreeing to act as chair. I didn't ask Jonathan to do this because he had given so much of himself to the book. I didn't dare. He volunteered, and if that tells us so much about his commitment to, I used to be young, but certainly no longer, to younger scholars. Anyway, I thank you all, those aforementioned figures. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. Welcome to my 18th century Damascene room. It's a reception room, and it's come courtesy of LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So with that done, let's get things underway. And I'm going to try and use a PowerPoint. So let's make sure everything works as it should do. So I'm going to share this screen, which should now come full screen to you. I think, Alison, could you nod if you can see everything? Perfect, perfect. So here's the cover of the book, which was published this summer by Edinburgh University Press. In order briefly to apprise you of the book's content, I fear I can do no better than refer to the blurb I wrote for Edinburgh, which was also reproduced on tonight's flyer. So as stated at the start of the blurb, it says, explores the Kaaba as it's been conceptualized, represented and used by Muslims from the earliest period of Islam onwards. And in many ways, that's the tagline for the book, the shortest way of summarizing it. And then the blurb goes on slightly more expansively to ask these questions. What is the Kaaba and why is it pivotal to the Islamic world? Why do pilgrims, I've lost the screen. Why do pilgrims go about it, not in it? Is it empty? And why is a hollow building covered in black silk? The most sacred site of Islam, the Kaaba, the granite cuboid structure at the center of the Great Mosque of Mecca, is here investigating 6 of its predominantly spatial effects as the qibla, the direction faced in prayer, as the axis and matrix mundi of the Islamic world, as an architectural principle in the bedrock of this world, as a circumambulated goal of pilgrimage and a site of spiritual union for mystics and Sufis, and as a dwelling that is imagined to shelter temporarily an animating force, but which otherwise, as a house, holds a void. To each of these 6 spatial effects, a chapter is dedicated, leading to this table of contents. So you can see to each one of these 6 predominantly spatial effects, I've dedicated a chapter. And I don't need to enumerate those, I don't need to go through them. I think I've just, that's fairly clear to everyone to see. Because I've already had the honor of presenting to the Royal Asiatic Society and the Islamic Art Circle at SOAS aspects of the 2nd and 5th spatial effect, for tonight's mini lecture, I thought I would present an aspect of the 3rd spatial effect, the Kaaba as an architectural principle in the bedrock of the Islamic world. I shall therefore share with you the first part of the chapter dedicated to that effect, namely chapter 3, the Kaaba as substructure. But in case you're worrying that we're going to have sit through a long spiel for a whole chapter, this is just an excerpt. And we're just going to do the first part. So I shall start reading and trying to animate the reading as I go forth. So this is an excerpt then of the start of the chapter 3, the Kaaba as substructure. This chapter concerns the Kaaba when its superstructure lies in ruins and only its substructure remains. Beginning with an account of destructions the Kaaba has suffered throughout its history, the chapter explores what those ruinations tell us about the Kaaba. Motivated by the knowledge that they have not occasioned the kind of apocalyptic anxiety that might be expected after the collapse of the world's alleged axis, the chapter asks how that could be. 4 reasons are adduced in answer, 2 for each of the chapter's 2 parts. One reason speaks of the role of the Kaaba at the apocalypse. Another speaks of the fact that what ultimately matters about the Kaaba are its allegedly unnatural, awesome foundations. A third speaks of the Kaaba's incorporation in Sufism as the human heart. And the 4th speaks of the role of the Kaaba in structuring foundational concepts of Islamic thought. As I've just said, only the first 2 will be covered in tonight's excerpt. For the Kaaba, there is no equivalent of the Old Testament's Book of Lamentations, even though the Kaaba, like the temple, has seen wrath and fury rain down upon it at the hands of warring forces. That it has done so on a number of occasions makes the absence of poetically charged commentary even more remarkable, especially as lamentation, ritha'a, over fallen towns and cities occupies an important position in Islamic literature. Lamentation is, for example, movingly employed to recount the destruction of Al-Andalus at the hands of the Christians during the Reconquista. Regarding the Kaaba, however, following its first alleged martial destruction in 684 of the Common Era, during the siege led by Al-Hussein ibn Numayr, and then its second alleged martial destruction in 692, during the siege led by Al-Hallaj ibn Yusuf, at the most, its ruins are compared to the bosoms of mourning women, Juyub al-Nisa. It is not that these 2 sieges have no significance in the early Islamic sources. To the contrary, many pages and verses are dedicated to what occasioned them and arose from them. Rather, what is noteworthy is the fact that in these pages and verses, the actual destruction of the Kaaba, including the splitting of the black stone during the first siege, does not provoke the kind of grief, anxiety, and trauma among the chroniclers that one might have expected, given the house's function as axis mundi. And in chapter 2, the second chapter of the book is dedicated to the notion of the Kaaba as axis and indeed matrix mundi. Even an eyewitness account of the ruined Kaaba after its destruction in the first siege is presented in rather neutral imagery. I came to Mecca with my mother on the day the Kaaba was burned. The fire had reached it, and I saw that it was without its silk veil. I saw that the Yamani corner of the Kaaba was black and had been cracked in 3 places. I asked, "What has happened to the Kaaba?" They pointed to one of the followers of Mecca's de facto ruler, Ibn al-Zubayr, and said, "It has been burned down because of this man. He put a firebrand on the tip of his spear. The wind made it fly. It struck the veils of the Kaaba between the Yamani corner and the black stone." Here and elsewhere in the sources, including notably the treatment of the 2 sieges by Al-Jahiz, the 9th century litterateur, factional politics are the focus of interest, not the world's potential collapse. As such, the contrast with the biblical laments for the destruction of the temple remains instructive. Instructive too is the observation that in the Islamic calendar, there is no day of collective mourning similar to the Jewish Tisha B'Av, the day on which the destruction of both the first and second temple is commemorated. Indeed, the one martial destruction of the Kaaba that does get commemorated in Islam is an abortive one, the divinely thwarted destruction by the pre-Islamic South Arabian ruler Abraha in circa 570. And here you can see this 14th century imagination of what happened when Abraha and his elephants came to attack the Kaaba. They refused to attack, and they bowed down outside the edge of the sacred mosque. And in this more, shall we call it, more decoratively imagined rendition of the same event, you see these circling elephants. Are they performing the circumambulation, perhaps? Are they doing the tawaf? Anyway, you get the birds, you can see the birds on the edges of the frame who are dropping down the stones onto the elephants and to the army. In part, this absence of apocalyptic language regarding destructions of the Kaaba is because there are hadiths which prophesize that it will be a bow-legged Abyssinian called Dhu Sawaiqatain, literally the short-legged one, not an Arab, who attacks and destroys the Kaaba and thus heralds the apocalypse. In other words, the Dhu Sawaiqatain prophecy prevents this or that destruction of the Kaaba from being interpreted as a sign of the apocalypse, because the prophecy's details present a reassuring contrast to what is actually being witnessed during these destructions. To that prophecy we now turn. A sound, sahih version of the Dhu Sawaiqatain prophecy reads as follows. Whoops, wrong one. Abdullah ibn Amr said, quote, "I heard the Prophet say, Dhu Sawaiqatain from Abyssinia will destroy the Kaaba, plunder its ornaments, and strip it of its kiswa. It is as if I could see him. He is slightly bald and slightly misshapen, and he strikes at the Kaaba with his shovel and pick," unquote, end of the hadith. A version of this prophecy is recalled in relief by the inhabitants of Mecca at the time of the second alleged siege and destruction of the Kaaba in 692. Quote, "When the army of Al-Hallaj came, because of this prophecy, we did not doubt it was them, the army of Al-Hallaj, excuse me, and not the army of the Abyssinian." Another version of it is illustrated. So here's a version of this prophecy about an Abyssinian black men coming in from Abyssinia with their picks to destroy the Kaaba and herald the apocalypse. And here's another version of it. These are both from 16th century texts, so from the same text, but both from the 16th century. Elsewhere in the Islamic sources, however, a less reported hadith predicts the apocalypse being heralded by the divine removal of the Kaaba, following 2 unspecified occasions of its destruction and presumably reconstruction. In this hadith, no mention is made of Dhu al-Sawaykatayn. The hadith reads, make the most of this house because it has been destroyed on 2 occasions, and on the 3rd occasion it will be removed. End of hadith, end of quote. A commentary on the hadith specifies that the meaning of on the 3rd occasion is not the 3rd occasion of the Kaaba's destruction, but its 3rd reconstruction. Because, the commentary explains, one would not use the word house to refer to ruins. Another less reported hadith, a divine hadith, hadith Qudsi, so called because God is the speaker, predicts the apocalypse commencing with the Kaaba's destruction. Again, no mention is made of the Abyssinian or indeed any intermediary acting as God's hammer. The hadith reads, quote, when I want to destroy the world, I will begin with my house, unquote. These 2 less reported hadiths do not, however, contradict the Dhu al-Sawaykatayn prophecy, because neither excludes the possibility that Dhu al-Sawaykatayn is the agent of the Kaaba's destruction. More importantly, neither hadith undermines the potential imminence of the prophecy. The details of the Dhu al-Sawaykatayn prophecy are imaginable as pertaining to the present, the here and now. In contrast, the 2 hadiths refer to a less imaginable, more obviously remote time, when 7 consecutive years have already elapsed with no one making the Hajj, and Gog and Magog have been unleashed to roam the earth. In summary of the foregoing discussion, the Dhu al-Sawaykatayn prophecy might have acted as a brake against viewing historical or allegedly historical destructions of the Kaaba in apocalyptic terms. This argument might even have a bearing on the partial destruction of the Kaaba and brutal sacking of Mecca in 930 by the adherent of a dissident branch of Ismaili Shia, the Karmatians, the Karamita of Bahrain. For although this group's profanation of the town and desecration of the Kaaba are represented in the sources as a profoundly traumatic moment in the history of Islam, to the best of my knowledge, the group's actions are not viewed apocalyptically. The late medieval chronicler of Mecca, Qutb-ud-Din al-Nahrawali, who dies in 1582, for example, says only this of the event, quote, what those brazen, evil people did was one of the greatest catastrophes, masa'ib, to strike Islam. For the religion, it was the harshest of them all. It dissolved the hearts of the faithful. Quote, end quote. These words are, to be sure, expressive of searing pain, but the representation remains free of apocalyptic overtones. Could that be because of the existence of the prophecy? The only people who viewed the Kaaba's desecration apocalyptically were the Karmatians themselves, especially their leader, Abu Tahir, who dies in 944. For him, the barbaric attack was intended as the harbinger of a new era, the end of the Islamic cycle of time and the dawn of the 7th final cycle. Okay, so that's a very possible, we've got this possibility that maybe Abu Tahir was thinking of that and might even have been imitating the prophecy. There are examples of others who have imitated prophetic sayings in order to try and herald this or that event. And it may well be that he was doing that. But Certainly there is no, but otherwise this is the only evidence we seem to have, and that's that these destructions were viewed apocalyptically. The foregoing argument that the Dhu Wasawai prophecy might have acted as a break against people interpreting destructions of the Kaaba in apocalyptic terms does not, however, hold entirely true for later periods of the building. That is so for two reasons. First, in 1610, so precariously leaning with the Kaaba's walls that, as described by a contemporary source, quote, it almost fell to pieces, and the world, which was embellished and decorated with its illustrious form, was almost torn asunder, unquote. Second, in 1630, the Kaaba was destroyed by torrential floods, and the people of Mecca took that as a sign of the world's end. Before the expansion and redevelopment of the town in the 20th century, the inhabitants of Mecca had been used to the flooding of the Kaaba and sacred mosque. That is because the town lies in a hollow in a steep wadi known as Batn Mecca, or the belly of Mecca, with the Kaaba located at the hollow's lowest point. This location is called Al-Batha, a toponym directly derived from the geography of the site, because the term Batha means the bottom of a watercourse. Notwithstanding this familiarity with flooding, for the inhabitants of Mecca, the flood of 1630 was especially violent, doing more than just damaging the Kaaba, but ruining it. According to Ayub Sabri Pasha, an Ottoman naval officer writing in the 19th century, but drawing from earlier and contemporary sources to describe this calamitous event, quote, the roar that the walls made as they collapsed, combined with the sound of the thunder and lightning, provoked such fear in the inhabitants of Mecca that some of them died from fright. The inhabitants believed that what happened that day was one of the signs of the apocalypse, unquote. Helpfully for his readers, Sabri Pasha visualizes this apocalyptic scene with an illustration. In view of Sabri Pasha's historical account, an additional explanation must be found to account for why, in the Islamic sources, the world does not seem to collapse with the various destructions of the Kaaba. The existence of the Dhu Wasawai prophecy is an insufficient explanation, because in Sabri Pasha's account, the inhabitants of Mecca do think the apocalypse is at hand, even if they soon realize they are mistaken. So promptly do they start working towards the Kaaba's reconstruction. The sought-for explanation, I shall argue, lies in the fact that all these destructions are superficial, related only to what stands ephemerally above the ground, not to what lies preternaturally beneath the Kaaba's foundations. As I shall show, these foundations often seem to matter more in the Islamic sources than what stands upon them, a paradox which a historian working in an idiom similar to the revisionist historians of Islam might simply explain with reference to a theory of Gerald Horton. Gerald Horton states that the way the Islamic period Kaaba is represented in the early Islamic sources results from an amalgamation of two different religious traditions, a Judaic axis mundi-based temple tradition, in other words, a foundations-based tradition, having been grafted imperfectly onto an important but local pre-Islamic shrine tradition. That the foundations of the Kaaba seem to matter more in the Islamic sources than what stands upon them is sufficiently easy to demonstrate, even if the reasons why are harder to ascertain. On the two occasions that the Kaaba is allegedly destroyed or severely damaged by implacable forces, either warring or natural ones, and the sources expatiate on the ensuing reconstruction process, what causes the inhabitants of Mecca the greatest anxiety is not the fact that the Kaaba has been destroyed. What terrifies them, rather, is the fact that the remains of the house must first be demolished in order for it to be rebuilt. In that activity of demolition, the Kaaba's foundations must necessarily be struck. The later of these two occasions is the alleged siege and destruction of the Kaaba in 684, which I mentioned at the start of this excerpt. According to Mecca's preeminent local historian, the 9th century Al-Azraqi, as soon as Ibn Umayyah's army had withdrawn from the town, the de facto ruler Ibn al-Zubayr turned his attention to rebuilding the ruined Kaaba. He asked the town's notables whether he should first tear down what remained standing of the building. On the basis of a prophetic hadith that warned against the repeated dismantling and rebuilding of the Kaaba because of a risk of belittling thereby its sacrality, most of the notables advised him against razing the remains, but to renovate it. Dissatisfied with this advice, Ibn Zubayr resolved to raze the remains and rebuild from the foundations up. So we read this. When he was ready, so this is the account, and this is as it reads, when he was ready for the demolition to commence, the people of Mecca left the town and went to Mina, where they stayed for 3 days. So just outside of, well, at some distance, maybe 4 miles outside from the sanctuary, where they stayed for 3 days, fearing a punishment would befall them if they razed the ruins. Ibn Zubayr then gave the order for his demolition, but no one dared to do it. When he saw this, he climbed the ruins himself, and taking a pick, he started demolishing the ruins and throwing down the stones. When the people saw that nothing had happened to him, they were emboldened and got up to demolish the ruins too. When Ibn al-Zubayr had demolished the Kaaba and leveled it to the ground, he discovered the foundations of Abraham. These extended into the semicircular hijr about 6 and a bit cubits, and they were like intertwined fingers of the necks of camels joined one to another. Disturbing the hijr at the foundations disturbed all the cornerstones of the Kaaba's foundations. Ibn al-Zubayr then called 50 of Mecca's notables and made them witness these foundations. A strong man from among them, Abdullah bin Muti' al-Adawi, inserted a crowbar into one of the house's cornerstones, and all the cornerstones shook together. It is said that Mecca convulsed violently at the moment the foundations shook, and the people were extremely frightened, to the point that those who had advised Ibn al-Zubayr to raze the ruins regretted doing so, and all were aghast and extremely distressed. The earlier of the two occasions happened during the lifetime of the Prophet. According to some reports, this was when he was 35, making the year 605, according to the standard chronology of the Prophet's life and death. At that time, 605, the inhabitants of Mecca set about rebuilding the Kaaba, either because it had been ruined by a flood or fire, or because its walls needed heightening and roofing, and its doors raising off the ground to prevent the ingress of thieves. In the earliest biography of the Prophet, as composed by Ibn al-Hisaq, who dies in 767, this act is recounted in terms very similar to al-Azraqi's account of the later destruction. So the account we've just read is very similar to the one recounted by Ibn al-Hisaq in the 8th century. The frequently identical narratives of these two purportedly historical occasions might suggest that the information recounted therein is more literary fantasy than fact. It might, however, also point to the spread, hold, and nature of the belief that the Kaaba's foundations are unearthly, unnatural, and extraordinary. Pursuing the latter surmise only, what more do we know about the Kaaba's foundations? In the Quran, the foundations of the Kaaba are referred to once, at the moment when that Abraham either builds or rebuilds the Kaaba. The verse reads, quote, "And when Abraham and Ishmael with him raised the foundations, yarfa'u al-qawa'id, of the house, they said, 'Our Lord, accept this from us. You are the all-seeing, all-hearing, the all-knowing,'" unquote. It is unclear what raising the foundations means in this verse, especially as the word used for foundations, qawa'id, has been interpreted by some exegetes to mean columns, walls, or even rows of bricks. Notwithstanding this uncertainty over the word's precise meaning, qawa'id is clearly some kind of load-bearing structure, a seat, as its etymology indicates. In that sense, foundation makes for a satisfactory translation. What, though, does it mean for Abraham to raise them? The Quranic exegetical tradition is too voluminous and varied to be characterized as having a univocal view on much of the Quran, and the interpretation of this Quranic verse is no exception. Nevertheless, one dominant narrative thread is that Abraham does not build the Kaaba from scratch, but rebuilds what Adam had either first built or received complete from heaven, namely the prototypical Kaaba, the celestial house. This Kaaba either eventually collapsed of its own accord or was elevated to heaven at the time of the flood, only its foundations remaining. I mean by the flood, I mean the Great Flood, Noah's flood, the biblical flood. Those foundations Abraham raises. As might be expected, not only does Mecca's historian Al-Azraqi confirm this narrative, he also elaborates on it. He claims, for example, that the foundations of Adam's Kaaba reach right down to the seventh earth. He additionally claims that the prototypical Kaaba is in fact the celestial Kaaba, the frequented house, al-Bayt al-Ma'mur. Regarding the first claim, Al-Azraqi reports a tradition alleging that Gabriel's wing struck the ground at the point where the Kaaba was to be built, and a firm foundation became exposed on the lowest earth. Angels then filled the chasm between this firm foundation and the earth's surface with huge rocks, and upon those rocks Adam built. Regarding the second claim, the celestial Kaaba, Al-Azraqi devotes a short chapter to the subject. He explains, 1, how the first thing that God placed on earth was the Kaaba, al-Bayt al-Haram, which God also designated as the future celestial Kaaba, al-Bayt al-Ma'mur. And 2, how at the time of the flood, Noah's flood, this Kaaba was elevated to heaven in silken brocades, destined to remain in heaven until the day of resurrection. More simply, he also says that the celestial Kaaba was sent down to earth for Adam's benefit, returning to heaven at the time of the flood. Al-Tabari, the 9th century historian, says something similar, with the additional clarification that when God removed the celestial Kaaba from the earth and returned it to heaven, quote unquote, its foundations remained. وَبَقِيَ أَسْآسُهُ. The foundations that remained are those then of an archetype, the prototypical Kaaba. What stands today in Mecca and what has been destroyed from time to time in the past is thus only a copy of that archetype. As a copy whose original was safe elsewhere, its destruction was never likely to spell calamity. And that leaves, and we're now at the end, for those are the first 2 reasons why I think we don't have apocalyptic anxiety at the destruction of the Kaaba. The other 2, you'll have to buy the book to see what they are, because the chapter, I think we've had enough of my talking from this mini lecture. And I'd like also to add 2 additional thanks, one to Matty Bradley of RAS for his IT support, and as I've already mentioned, to LACMA for their unofficial use of the Damascus room. Andrew, I think I hand over to you at this point.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Simon, for this very interesting discussion of one of, I think, what for me was one of the most interesting chapters of the book. And I've got a few questions which I'd like to put to you about sort of about the book in general and about this chapter. But before doing that, I'd like to make a comment which I think is really important and something that really struck me on reading this book. I mean, I'm an archaeologist by training who looks at Islamic culture, Islamic materiality, but I've also studied Islamic art, and I find this is one of the first books where consistently religion, the study of religion, Islam, is actually woven into the study of Islamic art. And this for me is kind of a revelation, because so many times religion is somehow taken out of Islamic art and it's looked at as something different. But here you're looking at Islamic art and using Islamic art to illustrate many of your points about the Kaaba. And I find this a very refreshing and important way of looking at Islamic materiality. So that's just a general comment which I think needs to be made. Jonathan mentioned something like this before, but I think it shows how unique and how interesting this book is.
Thank you.
So in terms of the first sort of general question I'd like to ask, because I think it is important for people to understand this, is why did you choose to study the Kaaba when so many people have not studied it or not given it attention? What is it? How did you start to study this? Decide that? What was the process by which you started studying the Kaaba, and why did you choose to select this very important building? Why did you choose to select a building which is intrinsically very, very difficult to study, both in terms of access, but also in terms of its very, very long history?
Thank you, Andrew. Before I answer, I just would like to make another thank you for your first comment. And I should add to anyone who's still listening to this, that Andrew, I didn't know what Andrew had made of the book. Andrew's always been a very quiet and supporter of me. He's always been very gentle and supportive. And I sent it to him because I thought he might be interested in it, but I hadn't heard from him. I didn't know what he thought of it. So of course, I'm relieved to know that he liked it, and I'm very grateful for what you've just said. So thank you, Andrew. Regarding your question, initially I wanted to explore the relationship that's often said to exist between the Dome of the Rock and the Kaaba, and I was trying to think about the sort of geography of sacrality. I was trying to think about sort of sacred places, and that was the original thing that I went to the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence on a grant, on a 6-month grant to study that, and for which I'm still very grateful. And as I was studying it there, I realized just how little work there had been on the Kaaba, and it just struck me as a job that needed doing, as something that was that needed doing, and I felt that perhaps I could do it because I had purposefully directed my PhD outside of Islamic art history by doing it in Middle Eastern studies, in good part, because of what you've just said, that I find it very difficult when religion is somehow bracketed outside of the material culture. It is a bracketing that I find difficult theoretically to maintain. And I think it's not going to hold much water for much longer. I think increasingly this is an idea that is coming under a lot of inspection. But that was why, and I felt that rather perhaps arrogantly, but I felt that with my background in Middle Eastern studies and Islamic studies, I could do this. I could write something about the Kaaba.
Okay, thank you very much for that very full answer. So the second question, which I think is again perhaps a general question, but I think it may help people who wish to read the book to understand your approach, which is the title of the book is Kaaba Orientations, and I know in other chapters you talk more about this. I'd like you to say a little bit about the question of orientation, because I think for many people and probably even the general public, their knowledge of Mecca and the Kaaba is, I suppose, mostly connected with the Hajj and also perhaps with praying. But I'd like you to say just a little bit about the concept of orientations as a structuring principle for your book.
Yes, at the first, first reading, the orientation is quite literal in the sense that how the Kaaba orients life. But I also use it in a second sense, just simply as another way of thinking of readings, or of, like, one gets oriented in. When you come to a university, one goes to an orientation. One gets sort of like inducted into how the place works. So in that sense, I play on this notion of orientation. It does refer to the fact that the Kaaba orients life, Islamic life, anchors it, but I also in the later chapters, particularly chapters 5 and 6, which are not to do with orientation in the spatial sense, but are to do with interpretations, readings about the Kaaba. But the main reading, the main usage of orientation is in this spatial sense, where the Kaaba is not just the focal point of people's prayers, but it is the center of that world, and it orients things from that center. It is, at least as described in the earliest sources, as something that organizes the world, sets directions, names 2 of the 4 winds. And we know from the work of David King, who this scientist the historian of Islamic science, we know that the Kaaba's, the fact that it is oriented to celestial phenomena, and that way it could be located wherever someone was in the world, be it a pre-Islamic Arab from Central Arabia or a Muslim, because as he has so carefully shown, the Kaaba is not oriented cardinally, but just slightly off cardinal directions, because the corners point to events in the sky, celestial events, which mean that, as I just said, a pre-Islamic Arab or a Muslim could be anywhere in the world, and if they knew the stars, they could always find where the Kaaba was, and that is I think a kind of orientation that not many people not many people know. I think whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims, I'm not sure that is too well known. And of course I claim no credit for that. That is all down to David King's work, but it does feature, and I make a lot of it. I hope to make good use of it in chapter 2.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting, and I think it's really good for you to actually explain that, because, as I say, I think it really sort of shows just how significant this structure is, and also how it sort of suffuses many aspects of Muslim life. Now, the third question is really focusing on a little bit more on what you talked about today, and it's the role of the Kaaba as substructure, and specifically foundations. And you talk about the symbolic significance of foundations. One of the interesting things which you read out, I think it's from Tabari, I'm not sure, but where you described when Ibn Zubayr had to destroy the Kaaba to rebuild it, and nobody else would actually partake in the destruction, which was necessary for the rebuilding, and so he started doing it himself, and that then some people joined in. And they actually found that the Kaaba was joined at foundation level with the Hijra, the semicircular kind of enclosure or wall, which is located next to the Kaaba. I suppose this question's sort of 2 parts. First of all, perhaps it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that. And then a related question, which I suppose comes from kind of my own background of archaeology, is just, I find this passage very interesting, because it talks about a very early example of the foundations being perhaps, I mean, do you think the foundations in some sense, there was an understanding that foundations could be a key to understanding the past and therefore the truth about this particular location?
Thank you. Yes. So shall we start with the second part? You would have thought that might be the case, but that there doesn't seem to be any kind of additional mythology caught up to it. When, for example, when they're taking it down for one of these moments when they have to demolish what remains of the Kaaba, they have to remove the black stone. Now, behind the black stone, they find an inscription that is said to have been written by God at the time that the world was made. Now, this was written behind there's nothing of that sort when it comes to these foundations. There's no, what might be said from a secular perspective, no obvious insertion, no attempt to kind of to mythologize this. It was, you had the opportunity to do it, but there doesn't need to be anything about it other than the fact that these foundations have a strange color, and that when a crowbar is placed into them, the entirety of Mecca seems to shake. But that seems to be a missed opportunity, whereas the black stone is clearly given additional value with this inscription that is said to have been behind it. So I think the answer to that is no, and it does become difficult to get away from Horting's thesis that there are two things at work here. There is a local, a provincial temple tradition at play, Mecca being an important but provincial site of pilgrimage in Central Arabia, that is conjoined with a tradition about temples that comes from Judaism, and it may not be specific to Jerusalem, but these two things come conjoined. In other words, there's a focus on foundations in Judaism. The Evet Shetir, of course, as everyone will know, is said to be the foundation stone of the world, and is said to have been at the heart of the Holy of Holies, or it's mostly thought that it was at the heart of the Holy of Holies in the first and second temple in Jerusalem. And that's a kind of foundations tradition that Horting argues gets imported into a temple tradition that doesn't focus on foundations, which is the Arab one, where the foundations are not especially important. And you could argue that's what you see in these accounts by Ibn Ishaq and Al-Azraqi and Tabari, that they're not that interested in the foundation particularly. They don't seem to get embellished. I don't know, but I must say, of the revisionist arguments, I find that very difficult to get past. It seems to me to be, to hold a lot of water. Regarding your, perhaps you could just sort of, so the first question talks about foundations again.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Well, yeah, I think that's kind of, yeah, no, that's fine. I was just asking about, yeah, I think you've answered. Yeah. So it was just there's just a very specific thing of what you thought might lie behind that relationship.
Well, and then your first question was about Hijr, this semicircular thing. It also has played a lot into. These aren't revisionists. They are, I think, I think they are malicious individuals. These people who argue that, and I don't think revisionists are malicious individuals, but there are people who maliciously argue. I believe maliciously argue that the Kaaba was never the Kaaba. It was in Petra, for example, and that was the original. That was the original qibla, the original prayer focus for Muslims. I think these are malicious. Most of them are malicious.
Certainly, yes.
And they use the Hijr. They use that semicircular Hijr, which is found to have been in the foundations, as proof that the Kaaba was once an apsical church. That the Hijr is actually an apse, and this apse means that the Kaaba was originally an apsical, well, it was a church with an apse. And, and I think the issue of hijra in and of itself is very interesting. It's quite what it was doing in the pre-Islamic time is very, very difficult to judge. I mean, there are some very interesting revisionist-based readings, which I think are very, one of them comes to mind by Nevo, very, very interesting, but all of which are ultimately speculative. But it certainly is interesting that there was a semicircular part of the Kaaba which doesn't get incorporated in the rebuilding that is left to stand after Hajjaj leaves it. Now, when Hajjaj rebuilds the Kaaba after its second martial destruction in the Islamic period, he does not incorporate this apsical, this semicircular part into the building. And the Prophet, is a hadith of the Prophet that says that he would have loved it. He would like this apsical part, this hijra, to be part of the Kaaba, but that there were insufficient funds for his tribe to incorporate it into the Kaaba when they were rebuilding it in 605. So there is this prophetic hadith that seems to argue that this hijra, this semicircular part, was once part of the Kaaba, that it would have extended the length of the Kaaba thereby and given it not a quaternary structure. Right now it has this quadratic, it has this cuboid structure, but had it had that apsical end, it would have been a different thing entirely. And one wonders then how it would have worked as this astronomy, as this device that could read the stars, because as David King has shown, the four corners are very carefully aligned. If it didn't have four corners, how could it have acted as this early astronomical station? I don't know. It's a field day for people who want to argue and counter-argue, because nothing will be proven ultimately, because we just don't have the evidence.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering that quite complex question in a very, very clear and lucid way. There's many more questions I have because it's a very interesting book, but I feel it's probably time to go to Alison, I think, who will take over from now.
Okay, well, as you've been told, if you would like to ask a question, then just type it into the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. But we do have a sorry, I just have to get my chat in line. Sorry, it's not. Sorry. Right, I finally it's zoomed up to the top of the page. So, Simon, I have a question here, and I wonder if you could comment on the relationship between the orientation to the Kaaba and the development of single point perspective in the post-Renaissance West.
Ah, yes. Well, yes, indeed. I argue in the 5th chapter that that the Kaaba is equivalent to the vanishing point, of linear perspective. That it's where sight goes, where sight ends, and as such, I argue that it's a kind of zero, because the vanishing point of linear perspective is, as mathematicians have called it, visual zero. And I argue in chapter 5, so at least in the third part, in the final part of chapter 5, that the Kaaba should be thought of as a kind of as an architectural zero, not so much visual zero, but architectural zero, a kind of the beginning point of a symbolic order. So much depends on the vanishing point of linear perspective, its importance to modern science, and its importance to the modern world is unquestionable, and that's not just said because I'm an art historian. It's proven, it's been argued by many people, scientists and mathematicians, that the invention of the vanishing point in the 15th century Florence, but which was probably earlier. But anyway, that's when it's argued. It's argued that the vanishing point is invented by Brunelleschi in the 15th century Florence, but almost certainly is something that occurs probably a bit earlier in the 14th century. But the invention of this vanishing point, which mathematicians call visual zero, I argue that, but without conclusive, but I argue unconclusively, because there's no means of proving it, that the Kaaba should be thought of as a kind of tectonic zero. And it's not without interest, although I don't argue anything on the basis of it, but it's not without interest that zero enters the Levant and therefore enters Arabia eventually in the 7th century, coming in from India. And you know, it's very difficult to be able to say more about this, and which is why I don't build an argument on it in anything more than just a suggestion. But I think there's just at first glance one can think of the Kaaba is where everyone is told in the Quran to turn their faces, right? They're told, the Quran instructs everyone to turn their faces to the sacred mosque, and by extension the Kaaba. And so that's one place that you're told to look at, and it's where sight ends. Your sight ends in the Kaaba, and sight ends similarly in the vanishing point of linear perspective and all that comes out of linear perspective. But it is, I'm aware, I didn't make that presentation today, very much aware that it's A, openly speculative, and B, it's not going to wash well with people who want much more empirical studies. And I respect that and understand that, which is why I devote only part of a chapter to it, but I think it's an important part.
Right.
Does that help, Alison?
Yes, it does. And I have another question here from Gregory. If the superstructure of the Kaaba matters relatively little in comparison with its substructure, how about the black stone? And what is the source of its significance? And why did some Muslim patrons, and he says, you mentioned a few Ottoman cases in your book, allegedly broke off or pieces from it to be incorporated into their own buildings? So the significance of that as well.
I'm hesitant to try to say there's an either or. I mean, I don't want to be saying that the black stone doesn't matter in the early sources. Of course it does, and therefore you would argue that the superstructure seems to matter. My argument about the superstructure is more that if the superstructure matters, why is there not apocalyptic anxiety when it's destroyed? It is not, my argument is not to say that since that apocalyptic anxiety does not exist, therefore the black stone is not important. I think you can hold both positions without one depending on the other. The black stone remains important. It seems to be important in these very earliest sources. And it has been argued by Western scholars that the Kaaba is just the support for the black stone, that the black stone is the origin of the Kaaba, and the quaternary structure of the Kaaba is merely a kind of frame for it, a kind of stage for it. I don't think there's any evidence to support this, and I think the best evidence to refute it is to go to King's arguments, because very clearly the quaternary structure of the Kaaba is functioning astronomically. It's working. The Kaaba is used for astronomical purposes, and that it can only be used for astronomical purposes because of its quaternary structure. The black stone, therefore, is not, I think, the origin of the Kaaba. It's not and the Kaaba is some kind of supplement to the black stone. The black stone is a stone that is said to have come down from paradise. It's said to have, there are many different traditions about it, how its origins, what it originally was, what kind of color it was. And it becomes, in some ways, it becomes if you've got a bit of the black stone, in a way, you've got the Kaaba. That's certainly how it seems to be used when, in the Ottoman period, black stone pieces appear above mihrabs in Istanbul, 1 or 2, and above a mausoleum also in Istanbul. So there's something about its association with the Kaaba that makes it almost represent the Kaaba, be the pars pro toto of the Kaaba. But I don't think that it is the kernel of the Kaaba. I certainly think that when we look at the hadith that shows the Prophet clearly, the tradition about Omar, the second rightly guided caliph, who is clearly anxious about kissing the black stone because he knows it's a kind of idolatry. Yet he says, I only do this because the Prophet Muhammad did this. I think that there's quite what the black stone is doing vis-a-vis the Kaaba is perhaps a question that could be looked at in more detail, which is slightly to hedge the answer. I mean, I think it's a question that he's looking at. I think it could be looked at more carefully, certainly.
Right. We have another question from Henry Gray. I have not read the book. I can't wait to do so. But he wanted to ask if you use Ghazali's Mysteries of the Pilgrimage in your research. And
yes,
we've just published it, and I found his sections on the meaning of the Kaaba and the black stone fascinating. The idea that the circumambulation is with the angels who are circumambulating the throne above in the al-Malakut.
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, I do use it. I didn't know about that translation. I use the translation. I mean, I use the Arabic, but I try to give the translation whenever possible so that others could A, verify what I'm saying, and B, immerse themselves in more detail with the source that I'm referring to. So I didn't know about this new translation. So I use one that's an MA dissertation actually, but it's available on the internet, and I make good use of it because, as you indicate, Ghazali has lots to say about the Kaaba. He above all goes into great detail about the meaning of the circumambulation of the Kaaba, and since I'm here to plug the book, I mean, I have it. Chapter 4 is about the circumambulation of the Kaaba. Chapter 4 is on the tawaf of the Kaaba, and Ghazali's book, which is one section of his vast book called The Revival of the Islamic Sciences, Ulum ad-Din, or Revival of the Religious Sciences rather. I make good use of that section of this vast book, which is dedicated to the Hajj and the mysteries of the pilgrimage, as Gray Henry explains. I'm sorry not to have known of this translation.
Well, we've been working on the Ihya al-Ulumuddin since 1980. We opened the Islamic Text Society in Cambridge in 1980, and I've got Fons Vitae in Louisville, Kentucky, and altogether we've got about 30 volumes. But in the past 5 years, we did books 1 through 7, which had never done. And we just finished the Mysteries of the Pilgrimage,
right,
which I found riveting. And what really also struck me when you talked about that person saying, I wouldn't have kissed the black stone had I not seen the prophet. And then he received this answer, not the answer that I was used to, which was, if the prophet kissed it, that's why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
But then this thing, which I think you're referring to about this inscription that is behind the black stone, it's explained to him, no, not at all. When God spoke to Adam and said, am I not your Lord? And all humanity is in Adam's loins. And then God says, lest you plead ignorance of this relationship at the day of reckoning, the contract, the act between God and all of humanity to come is enclosed in the black stone. And then when the Muslims begin to do the tawaf, the first thing they say before beginning is they reaffirm that. And then if they're making the Hajj, by the time they finish Arafat, they've come to the preview of the last day and everybody assembled. But I wondered what this inscription was you mentioned behind the black stone in the Kaaba wall.
Well, it is related to that, and you're absolutely, that hadith that you talk about, which often gets cut out. I think it's Ali that speaks to I can't remember who. Is it Ali that rebukes Omar? Anyway, who says no, not at all. It is related to this, but ultimately the tradition you're recounting is about the fact that the black stone will speak on the day of judgment, and will speak for people whether they have greeted it or not on their Hajj, and it's where you kind of make fealty to your Lord. And so this is why I said, and perhaps not so much sheepishly. I mean, I don't claim to have covered everything about the Kaaba in this book. I make no bones about that. But I do think that there would be interesting work to be done on the black stone and its relationship to the Kaaba. And
well, we're more than happy to send you the book. We're using, because Ghazali died in 1111. In 2011, the Dar al-Minhaj Press, actually in Saudi Arabia, oddly, brought out the latest critical edition of the entire Ihya Ulumuddin. So we're working entirely from the latest critical edition. I'm very happy to send you the book.
Well, it's very nice to meet you, and I shall find you and I shall email you and take that up. Thank you so much. We can do an exchange, perhaps.
Please, I'd happy to do that.
Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I think we might draw everything to an end, because I'm sure, Simon, you are exhausted. It's now 19:15, so you've been going for an hour and a quarter, and time for you to lie down on your cushions and relax in your beautiful room behind you. But I would just like to say thank you very, very much, really, for a wonderful presentation for your book, which I look forward to reading very much. And of course, thank you to Andrew, Jonathan, and Rosalind as well, and you, of course. And I hope you can have a bit of a rest now. I don't know if anybody else wants to. Jonathan, would you like to say anything?
Unmuted. Just again, express my thanks to all of you for arranging this, and to Simon for doing such a marvelous job of talking about his book.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Very much. Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.